Good evening. Welcome to MUFON LA. During the 1950s and 1960s, unidentified flying objects routinely made headlines in newspapers across the United States. According to a study by journalism professor Herbert Strentz, possibly 1 million or more U.S. newspaper stories had been published up to 1966. This widespread media coverage clearly displeased government officials who undertook to discourage media and public interest in the phenomenon. Today, although UFOs continue to be cited and reported around the world, leading U.S. news organizations rarely treat UFOs as serious business. How did this remarkable change in journalistic emphasis come about? In his book, The Missing Times, Terry Hansen investigates the extent to which leading news organizations have quietly cooperated with government officials to limit the UFO reporting because of national security concerns. Reviewer John Peterson, writing in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, called The Missing Times possibly the most important book about UFOs in decades. More recently, The Missing Times was cited as the best UFO book of 2002, according to Britain's UFO magazine. Terry Hansen holds a degree in biology and science journalism from the University of Minnesota and has worked as a magazine writer and editor for some 20 years. In 1986, he co-founded KFH Publications, a Seattle computer magazine publishing company. His interest in news media coverage of the UFO controversy stems from research papers written about the subject during graduate school. He has organized and moderated 2 symposiums in Minnesota about the science of politics of UFO research. Terry Hansen has also been a guest on numerous local and national broadcast programs, including Whitley Strieber's Dreamland, Jeff Rentz's Sightings, and cable TV's History Channel. Please let's all give a warm welcome for Terry Hansen.
Well, thank you very much for coming out on a Tuesday evening. I'm usually curled up in front of the television on a night like this. I've specified the years 1945 to 2004 somewhat arbitrarily, but as you're probably aware, the United States did not have a free press during the war years. From about the early or late 30s on through 1945, there was overt censorship, government censorship of the media, and so it's rather hard to know exactly what the UFO phenomena, what was happening with the UFO phenomena during that period, if there was such a thing. But after 1945, the United States ostensibly returned to a peacetime situation, and the media was free to talk about what was happening in the country. And it was just after the war that the UFO phenomenon became a fairly important story, and it evolved sort of downhill from there, and that's basically what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about how that came about. Slide, please. Before I get into that, I just wanted to say a little bit about how I personally became interested in the topic and how my thinking about the subject has evolved over some decades. In the early 1970s, I was a biology student at the University of Minnesota, and I was very interested in the biochemical origins of life and the search for extraterrestrial life and so on, and I pretty much read everything I could get my hands on that topic. And it struck me as being very odd that the scientific community was not looking at the UFO phenomenon in some relatively serious fashion. There was not much research being done by mainstream scientists. And initially, I thought that it was really a matter of the psychology of the scientific community. Scientists generally tend to be, they tend to react against any phenomenon which undercuts their theories about how the universe works, and their instinctive reaction often is to just ignore the data or to not study the phenomenon. But after I began looking at public opinion polls and surveys of scientists, I realized that it really wasn't the scientific community that was opposed to studying the UFO phenomenon. Actually, the skeptics, according to most polls and surveys in the scientific community and the engineering community, were in the minority. Most people accepted that there was a UFO phenomenon. They may not have agreed on what it was all about, but they at least were interested in the topic and were willing to do research on it. And I began to realize after a while that a lot of the resistance to looking at the topic seriously came from the media. The science journalists, people like that, were very aggressively anti-UFO, and that sort of puzzled me, and I began to think quite a bit more about the role of the media in the controversy. Slide, please. Now, I sort of entered this whole subject by using a case study that I knew quite a bit about. In 1975, a very close friend of mine whom I'd known since childhood called me up on the phone, and he said he was living in Great Falls, Montana at the time. He was a radio disc jockey, and he said, "You're not going to believe what's happening out here. You know, I was sitting at home the other night, and I had my VHF scanning radio on, and the sheriffs were out chasing UFOs over the ICBM sites." So this was rather interesting to me, to say the least, and I tried to find out more about it in my local media in Minnesota and the national media, but it seemed very elusive. I couldn't really find out any more about it. Now, I just maybe should talk a little bit about the ICBMs, just to give you a little background. The top photo here is, I believe, and we have an authority here who can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this is one of the missile sites. Isn't that right, Robert? And it's shown from the surface. You don't really see very much. If you've driven around in the western United States, you've probably seen these. You may not have known what they were. It's a fairly unobtrusive facility. It's usually a large blast door with some antennas and a chain link fence and signs threatening lethal force if you mess with the facility. But most of the facility, as you can see in the lower photo, is down below ground. These missiles are scattered all over the Great Falls area, around the Great Falls area of Malmstrom Air Force Base, and a wing or a group of missiles is controlled by one launch complex, launch control facility, as I think they used to refer to them. So on the night in question, the period in question that my friend was telling me about, these UFOs were for some reason coming down over these missile complexes and setting off alarms or triggering the attention of the guards and so forth. A lot of activity, and this went on for a long period of time, probably several months. In parallel with all this, there was a lot of, for lack of a better word, cattle mutilations. There were a lot of the ranchers were reporting that their cattle were being killed and mutilated in strange fashions. Now, whether this was connected with the UFO phenomenon is something people still argue about today, but the fact of the matter is that these two phenomena were operating in parallel, and because the ranchers were losing cattle, it was an important economic story. And so the press was very interested in it as a result. The press wanted to get to the bottom of what was going on. Next slide, please. The interesting thing about this whole episode was that there was, although the national media, as far as I've been able to tell, did not take any interest in this story, even though it went on for months, there was a lot of regional press coverage. The Great Falls Tribune and other major newspapers in the state of Montana covered this story extensively, and it was very well known to people living around the Great Falls area and across Montana generally. And some of the articles were rather remarkable, really, if you read through these. Next slide, please. For example, this article, I guess it's from the. This is the Great Falls Tribune. Reports phantom aircraft again observed north of the city. So it reports at the very top. I don't have my laser pointer with me, unfortunately, but it says there were a number of phantom aircraft in the vicinity of several Minuteman missile sites. And then down below, it mentions the fact that Air Force helicopter pilots stationed at Malmstrom said Thursday that while it's possible to fly during high winds such as Wednesday night, which were clocked at 45 miles per hour with gusts up to 58 miles per hour, it would be hazardous. Well, I think that's an understatement. I'm a private pilot myself, and I certainly would not attempt to take off in a light plane with winds gusting to nearly 60 miles per hour. So the conventional explanation that these were helicopters from somewhere doesn't hold up for this and many other reasons. This phenomenon was highly unusual in many respects, although there may have been helicopter activity paralleling these events. Next slide, please. What's also interesting is that an Air Force spokesman actually acknowledged to the media that some kind of phenomenon, quote unquote, was observed by Minutemen Guard personnel on 6 or 7 different evenings. So it's pretty astonishing that an Air Force spokesman would actually make an admission like this to the media. But of course, after that they sort of blew it off and said, but we're not concerned about it. Well, that's kind of astonishing, and a lot of the readers found it hard to take. Somebody wrote into the newspaper and he said, you know, he's just incredulous. He says, at the same time this flying object hovered over or near the missile station, no aircraft was sent out to investigate. Do we have responsible people in charge of things like this, or a bunch of Air Force Academy graduates sitting on their hind ends and waiting for a Pearl Harbor again? So there was a real mismatch between what was happening and the response publicly by the Air Force. It just seemed very, very odd that they would not be concerned about something like this. And in fact, I think the local sheriff and law enforcement people knew that they were very concerned about it. Now, this went on, as I said, for quite a long time. A problem with a lot of UFO incidents is that there's 1 or 2 sightings and then it passes and there's nothing more to report. But this particular incident went on for an extended period of time, and that's what makes it interesting. You can really get your teeth into this story because there was a lot of press coverage. There was a book written about it by Cascade County Deputy Sheriff, and later on there were a lot of Freedom of Information Act documents that came out about this incident. So it's extremely well documented, and I don't think any reasonable person can deny that there were some highly unusual things going on at the time. But as I said, the national news media was pretty much oblivious to the whole thing and didn't seem to be particularly interested. Now, is that because they didn't know about it? Well, I don't think that's possible, because you know, in cities like Great Falls, the networks have local affiliates. They have their local stringers, their freelance writers, their wire services. There's simply no way that the national media couldn't have been aware that this was happening, and yet there was just evidently no interest in covering it. Until about 2 years later, next slide. Okay, sorry, I didn't realize it changed. 2 years later, the story finally got some national attention, and it was reported in, of all places, the National Enquirer. Now, I don't have to say that the intelligentsia here in the United States does not take the National Enquirer seriously as a source of reliable news. So the very fact that the story got reported in the National Enquirer tended to have the effect of dismissing it, blowing it off as a serious news story. And it took about one of the interesting things, though, about this story is that it's actually entirely accurate. Although it doesn't give a lot of details about the Malmstrom cases, it does mention them, and it mentions the fact that there were similar incidents going on at other Air Force facilities across the northern part of the United States. So it's a fairly big story. I think any journalist would look at this and say, this is definitely something worth covering, but yet there was no real interest on the part of the national media to pursue the story. Now, 2 years later, after this story appeared, and you can give me the next slide, there was some coverage in the in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and so it took about 4 years for the news to travel from Montana to the East Coast, which is, I think you'll agree, a little unusual for a story of this magnitude. So this piqued my curiosity. How can it be? You know, we're told that if any event of consequence that occurs in the United States gets carried across the country in no time at all. But this is not really the case with UFO sightings for some reason. And I can cite other examples equally remarkable. You're probably aware of the Hudson Valley, New York sightings. This was a big story in New York. Again, it was covered at the local, regional level by the papers, but the New York Times and other newspapers expressed relatively little interest in pursuing it. There were some rather amazing sightings in Belgium of a black triangle, as it was called, and it was chased by an F-16 fighter, received a lot of press in Europe, big article in Paris Match. But again, there was only one story that I know of in the elite news media about this in the United States. That was the Wall Street Journal, and they basically kind of made a joke out of it. Well, it wasn't a joke in Europe. Other examples of this phenomenon, the Cash Landrum incident, where some people were seriously hurt in Texas after an encounter with some unusual object or aircraft. The Phoenix Light sightings, the Mexico and Brazil sightings, and more recently there was a report issued by some French government officials and retired government officials and Air Force personnel, military personnel, called Comita, however you pronounce it. And then there was a press conference sometime back where a lot of highly credible people and some not so credible people came forth and told their stories. And although it did get some coverage, I watched the national networks and PBS that night, and they didn't even mention it. Just was completely off their radar. So this phenomenon of ignoring the news, or ignoring the UFO topic, or not treating it as a serious news story, was very intriguing to me, and I wanted to really understand the whole situation better. Next slide, please. Okay. What you see when you study the news coverage of UFOs, the media coverage of UFOs, is that there's kind of two realities defined by the media in this country. There's what I call folk reality, and I don't mean to suggest by that term that it's not actually happening, but that it's closer to ordinary people, or what ordinary people experience. The regional news media kind of reflect that, the folk reality. They do report UFO sightings, and they do take the story seriously. They treat it as a legitimate news story. Generally speaking, there are exceptions certainly, but that's generally the rule, is that they do take it seriously. Whereas at the elite level, the elite media, they tend to reflect the point of view of the U.S. government, which is that UFOs are not worth taking seriously. They often ridicule the subject overtly, and just generally just don't report it. Next. Some other journalistic anomalies that jump out at you have to do with polls and surveys. And I talked about this earlier, that if you look at public opinion data, scientists and engineers, the majority of scientists and engineers do accept that there is a UFO phenomenon, and they're interested in studying it. But science journalists and the media at the national level especially are almost universally hostile to reporting the topic or discussing it. I think if you follow major science magazines like New Scientist and Scientific American and so forth, Discover, you wait for a long time to see a serious article about the UFO phenomenon. Also, the aviation press rarely, if ever, covers the UFO topic, even though commercial airline pilots have often reported seeing UFOs. So that's a little bit odd. Next. So in trying to get a handle on this and trying to understand why there's this huge gap between the way the regional media treat the subject and the way the elite media treat the subject, I kind of borrow an expression from Mark Twain. He said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So the lesson there is that if you look back in history and you study the way the news media and the government have worked together on other similar issues, it will give you some insight into why things have evolved this way with UFOs. That was my general approach. Next. My hypothesis was that if UFOs are a national security problem, then that would explain a lot of why the big news organizations treat it the way they do, because historically there's been a lot of cooperation between the news organizations, the major news organizations, and the military and intelligence agencies to address urgent national security matters, particularly during wartime or threatening situations. But are UFOs really a national security issue? That's the question we want to look at next. And I argue in my book that there are many, many reasons for believing that they are a very serious national security issue, even though the government may deny that. If you go back to the early 50s and read some of the internal CIA documentation, memos and so forth, such as the Chadwell memo, it describes the fact that there are strange aircraft or vehicles operating in the vicinity of military installations, and that the matter requires urgent attention by the intelligence and military establishment. Also, if you read Ruppelt's book, Edward Ruppelt, he mentions this fact that there was a correlation between UFO sightings and military installations. This is a very disturbing development if you're responsible for the defense of the United States. I think you'd have to agree. And in fact, Eisenhower made a comment, which I'll show you later. It was reported on the front page of the New York Times, where he actually had to deny that UFOs or that flying saucers were invading the Earth from outer space. It was pretty astonishing. It shows you the level at which the topic was taken seriously at that time. Now, a second aspect. I should point out, it's pretty obvious already, that I kind of broke these down into physical threats and social threats. So I'm talking about the physical threats first. The second one in the physical threat category is threats to safe air navigation. There are a lot of cases where UFOs have interacted with aircraft and sometimes evidently or seemingly caused the aircraft to malfunction or even crash, and I'll give some examples of that. The third one under physical is surveillance or interference with military facilities. Now, UFOs have been known or have been reported to actually interfere with ICBMs and other military hardware from time to time. So that's an obvious national security issue. The fourth one is psychological warfare. There was a lot of discussion whether it was legitimate or not, I don't know, but the CIA in the early 50s was interested in or concerned that the Soviets, for example, might use the UFO phenomenon as a cover for an attack on the United States, to throw our defense personnel into chaos and confusion. Under social threats, and these may be actually some of the more serious ones, there's the issue of mass panic. Now, in the late 1930s, 1938, there was a famous broadcast by Orson Welles on a CBS program where he dramatized an invasion of the Earth from Mars, and it had quite a big impact at the time, and could not have failed to impress government policymakers with the importance of managing what the news media say about this topic. Culture shock is the second one. Both psychologist Carl Jung and a report by the Brookings Institution commissioned by the U.S. government concluded that the impact on American society, or actually world society, from the impact the impact on world society from contact with a more advanced civilization could be very severe, very detrimental. The third one I call technology transfer issues. Now, if it's true that some UFOs are technological devices, as we think of them, then it's obvious, or it should be obvious to military planners, that they might be able to learn something from these and employ that technology in weapons of one kind or another. So it has kind of an economic and military status quo upsetting factor. The fourth one is the legal fallout from the cover-up, assuming that there is one, and I think there is. And there's a lot I could say about that, but basically, if it's true that the government has been covering this stuff up and doing a lot of highly illegal things over the years, it sort of could precipitate a constitutional crisis of sorts. Let me just give a couple of examples of these different threats to national security. Next slide. This was the item that I mentioned earlier. Eisenhower discounts saucer from space. This was the New York Times, December 16, 1954, where the President of the United States actually had to make a public statement about what was going on, because there was such a lot of coverage and discussion of the topic at the time and concern about what was happening. And so the President actually had to reassure the public that things were okay. Whether they were really okay, I don't know, but that's what he said. Another slide. Okay, now this has to do with the aircraft navigation threat. This was a story that appeared on the front page of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, one of Seattle's two major newspapers, back in 1959. I think that's right. April 2nd, 1959. C-118 aircraft took off from Tacoma, or from McChord Air Force Base near Tacoma, and reported that it had collided with something, or something had collided with it. What it actually hit, or what hit it, was never determined, I don't think. As far as I know, there was no other aircraft wreckage found, but the aircraft came down in flaming wreckage. So there were some odd things happening back then, and there was a suspicion, whether it was real or whether it was true or not, that perhaps this had something to do with the UFO phenomenon, because a lot of commercial pilots and military pilots were reporting UFO sightings at that time. Next slide. Okay, this is an article from the New York Times that discusses the Brookings Institution study that warns that world civilization could collapse if contact with an advanced civilization takes place. I've never actually read this study. Has anyone here read it, the actual Brookings study? Oh, okay. It'd be interesting to read. I don't know when the study was commissioned, but I suspect it was probably originally commissioned in the 50s and then later appeared sometime around 1960. I don't know. Okay, next slide. Okay, well, in my book, I try to really ask and answer three basic questions. You know, is it really possible to censor information in what we think of, or what we're told, as a free and open society? And how does that work? You know, if it's been done in the past, we can look at the historical examples and understand the mechanics of it. And third, is there evidence that such media deception has taken place in the past 60 years in regard to UFOs? Next slide. In my book, I devote an entire chapter to looking at government censorship, and another chapter to the use of propaganda. And I'm going to compress all that into a few slides here, but basically, next slide. A lot of people, you know, if you tell people, well, the media is working with the government, a lot of sophisticated people will sort of laugh at you and say, oh, come now, you don't really believe that. But if you really study the history of the American news media and also the British news media, you begin to understand how this relationship came about. There was always a desire on the part of the U.S. government during wartime to influence what the media says about war. This goes way back probably to revolutionary times, but certainly during the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, there were attempts to try to censor or distort what the news media was saying about world events. But it really got underway in a highly organized fashion during World War I. The United States, although it's quite warlike today, was not initially a warlike country in the early part of the 20th century. We had had a very bad experience with war in the Civil War period, and by the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of people who remembered war firsthand. They were in it. They knew of friends or relatives who had died. They were not really very anxious to get back into another European war. So there was a tremendous amount of opposition to becoming involved in World War I. Now, the British were already involved, and they were in a very serious mess because they were really at loggerheads with the Germans, and the war was going nowhere, and there was a very real possibility that they could lose the war, or at least the war would never be resolved unless the United States entered the war on the side of the British. At the time, the British government, which had been managing a global empire for some time, had forged close relationships with all the major newspapers in Britain. And the newspapers were an integral part of the propaganda machine that the British used to control their people and to persuade them to fight the war, not only World War I, but other wars as well. So the British were very, very adept at the use of censorship and propaganda, and they turned this whole censorship apparatus on the United States with the objective of changing American public opinion and bringing the U.S. into the war on their behalf. There were a lot of stages in this. It was a long, drawn-out process, but basically they used the wire service to disseminate propaganda stories. They urged Congress and the President to take a number of actions to convince Americans that the war was a good thing. The U.S. Congress passed the Sedition Act in 1918, which made it essentially illegal to protest the war. If you, unlike during the Vietnam War period, which I'm familiar with, when people could speak out against the war, during World War II or World War I, that was not possible. If you were to do that, you would be very likely arrested and thrown into jail. And that was the end of it. You simply could not oppose the war. It was not legal. Another thing that President Wilson did was that he brought the progressive journalists into the propaganda effort. In the early part of the century, there was a journalistic movement called the Progressive Movement, which was devoted to exposing corruption in big business and government and so forth. And this was kind of a political stroke of genius, but Wilson brought these people into the propaganda machine and appointed them, gave them high-ranking appointments in the propaganda bureaucracy. One of them was named George Creel, and Creel was appointed to head the U.S. propaganda machine, which was known as the Committee on Public Information. The Committee on Public Information, or CPI, then enlisted news organizations across the United States and other high-profile people in order to promote the war and bring Americans behind the war effort. But one of the more creative things they did was called the 4-Minute Men campaign, and this was really quite ingenious. They created a nationwide network of public opinion leaders in cities and towns across the country. It was kind of like a club of sorts, and they had a newsletter and everything. And the whole idea was that these guys would go out to public events like this one, or a movie theater or a play, and they would get up before the play would begin and sort of pretend to give this spontaneous rousing cry for supporting the war. And this illustrates an important aspect of propaganda, which is that you always focus on opinion leaders who then bring everyone else into the effort. Now, the result of all this was that the public, especially in Britain, was completely unaware of what was going on in Europe, and Britain sacrificed almost an entire generation of young men. There were, I think, about 10 million dead and 12 million wounded in World War I. It was a horrible bloodbath, but the public didn't know about it until it was almost all over, and by then, of course, it was far too late. Okay, next slide. Now, a similar relationship between the British and Americans, and also between the American news media and the U.S. government, developed during World War II, only it was much more sophisticated and much more, I think, heartfelt. The journalists and generals in World War II were behind the war 100%. There was almost no such thing as objective news coverage during World War II. And Britain tutored the United States intelligence establishment in its techniques of propaganda and deception. So this is really where the U.S. started to develop its own intelligence apparatus, the OSS, which later became the CIA. By this time, propaganda and censorship were far too sophisticated for one organization, and they actually had two different ones. They had the Office of Censorship, administering control over the news, and the Office of War Information, administering propaganda. And the important thing to realize about this is that leading media executives, journalists, and people like that were placed in the position of censoring and distorting the news. So this, as I say, it consolidated the relationship between the military intelligence community and the American news media. And after the war, this relationship didn't end. Next. as we know from a number of articles that were written about this in the 1970s, top media executives at news organizations like the New York Times, Time Magazine, CBS, and so forth retained these close working relationships with the national security state, and the American news media came to embrace the idea that the United States was locked in a perpetual battle against evil forces, specifically communism initially and various other things. So this assumption that the U.S. was locked in this life or death struggle sort of became incorporated into the worldview of many journalists and media executives, and so a kind of revolving door developed where journalists would go into the intelligence business, and intelligence agents would go into journalism undercover. The CIA developed a huge propaganda machine under the direction of Frank Wisner. It was called Wisner's Wurlitzer, because Wisner bragged that he could play any tune the CIA wanted and the world would hear it. He had such a wide array of organizations at his disposal. During the Vietnam War, anti-war press coverage was covertly attacked by the CIA and the FBI, and the elite media, the New York Times and organizations such as that, supported the war right up until the bitter end, even after all corporations and the American public had turned against it. So the result is that the deception became a very widespread practice for managing public opinion, and very tempting thing to use for politicians. Next slide. Now, after World War II, there were a lot of other things that happened that sort of institutionalized censorship and secrecy generally. There was the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, and that ushered in the idea that information was instantly classified and would remain so sometimes for decades or indefinitely. There was something called the National Security Act, which created the Central Intelligence Agency and gave the CIA, by the way, the power to censor and propagandize officially. The UK-USA Treaty, sometimes known as the Secret Treaty, brought the major English-speaking nations together into one large intelligence-gathering club, if you want to put it that way. There was something really interesting called the Invention Secrecy Act of 1951, and that allowed the U.S. government to seize inventions that presented, in their judgment, national security risks, and the decisions about whether an invention presents a national security risk was and still is made by the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and NASA. A lot of people think of NASA as an organization devoted to openness and all this, because that's what they say, but in fact NASA is very much part of the national security apparatus. And the censorship began to spread from nuclear matters to many other things. So it just sort of began to creep outward like a fungus through the government. Next slide. These ties between the American news media and the intelligence community were exposed in the 1970s. There was an article in the Columbia Journalism Review and later in Rolling Stone magazine by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame. And so it was pretty much, the cat was out of the bag, but the impression was given that because it was reported, it stopped. Well, I don't think it really did stop. I think it's going on even today. And there are many reasons for that, many reasons to conclude that. Let me just go to the next slide here. I just want to talk a little bit about the wire services. A lot of people think the wire services are, completely independent of the government and all that, but there's a long history of governments using the wire services to not only to censor the news, but also disseminate propaganda. And this is a good example. This was an article that appeared after my book came out, actually, March 24th, 2001, by Tim Weiner, saying that during the Bay of Pigs period, the CIA had the ability to plant propaganda stories directly on the international news wires with the assistance of AP and UPI. So it just shows you that this kind of relationship does exist. Next slide. This is an obituary of Sig Mickelson, who was, I guess, the first director of CBS News, and he died some years ago, year 2000. But I picked this article because he's quoted in here saying, well, you know, back in the 1950s, we really didn't raise an eyebrow about cooperating with the CIA. So it was casual. You know, there was a lot of cooperation between the major news organizations, and that will become important a little later on. Next slide. Now, if you think things have changed any, go on to the website of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting or National Public Radio and check out what the two chief executive officers of those organizations did for a living most of their career. They basically were official government propagandists. So they were in charge of telling a version of world events that was consistent with U.S. policy objectives. And now they're in charge of public broadcasting, which doesn't give me a lot of confidence in public broadcasting. Next slide. This is the first slide was of Robert Coonrad. This is Kevin Close, President and CEO of National Public Radio. And again, many resume items related to propaganda here. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to switch from talking about the media to talking a little bit about UFOs. A lot of this is probably very well known to this audience, but I'll just breeze through a few key points here. Next slide. There are a number of things that happened in the past 60 to 80 years that are significant that you sort of have to be aware of in understanding why UFOs became a public policy issue for the United States government. The whole phenomenon, or the whole how should I say, the area of study of unusual phenomenon was kind of founded by a man named Charles Fort at the upper left there. He wrote a series of books in the early part of the century about anomalous phenomena that were being reported in scientific periodicals and newspapers and so forth. He collected them all together. He would go to the library and study, you know, go through old magazines and newspapers and so forth and write these up. These books were quite popular. And it's the first time that anybody really noticed that there were some odd things going on out there that didn't really fit with conventional wisdom. In 1938, as I've already said, there was a famous broadcast by Orson Welles of War of the Worlds, and it sparked a nationwide panic. 1940s, we had the Foo Fighters and ghost rocket phenomenon. The extent of this was obscured to a large extent by military censorship at the time. And even after World War II had ended, the ghost rocket phenomenon was of such concern to military authorities that military censorship was actually reimposed on several Scandinavian countries, even after the war had been over for some time. In 1947, there was the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting. This was not the first sighting of its kind, but it was the first one to get a lot of nationwide media attention, and it sort of precipitated a lot of other interest. A lot of media coverage started after that. And there, of course, the Roswell incident in 1947. Next slide. There was a huge wave of UFO activity in 1952, and in 1952 also there was a memo by H. Marshall Chadwell warning the CIA of UFO activity at major defense installations. So shortly thereafter, the CIA got involved in managing the public's impression of what the UFO phenomenon was all about and what was happening. Now, if you listen to the CIA's version of history, they more or less try to give the impression that the Robertson Panel didn't do anything. They talked about having this media training programming, or media program of training and debunking, but they didn't actually carry it out because they thought it was illegal or whatever. But I'm going to show you some evidence that suggests that is definitely not the case. There was another major wave of UFO activity in 1954. In 1966 and 67, again, a huge wave of activity. And this was a period where, as far as I know, the first time that UFOs began interacting with the ICBM complexes in Montana and other places around the world. And we have someone here in the audience, Robert Salas, who was actually in one of these ICBM launch complexes at a time when a UFO apparently interfered with or shut down what, 11 missiles, something like
Actually,
that?
we shut down 8.
8 missiles?
8 missiles,
Okay.
all in rapid succession.
Okay. And the incident to this day has really not been satisfactorily explained. I think that's safe to say, isn't it? At about the same time, CBS News carried a program narrated by Walter Cronkite down at the bottom there. It was called UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But it had a big impact on public opinion because the whole thrust of the program was that UFOs are not anything to be worried about. They're just a case of mistaken identity and so forth. The Air Force had been struggling with the UFO public relations problem for quite a long time. And in 1966 and 67, it finally turned it over to the University of Colorado. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. And then 75 brings us back to the UFO sightings over the nuclear weapons installations that I talked about earlier. Okay, next slide. If you're trying to deceive somebody about something, if a government particularly is trying to deceive somebody, the public specifically, the mechanics of doing that are very well understood by psychologists, social psychologists, and propaganda experts. It's really a two-step process. The first step is that you censor what's happening. You close off public knowledge of real-world events. And I quote a very famous journalist and public opinion expert, Walter Lippmann. He says, without some form of censorship, propaganda in the strict sense of the word is impossible. In order to conduct a propaganda, there must be some barrier between the public and the event. Access to the real environment must be limited before anyone can create a pseudo-environment or a false environment that he thinks is wise or desirable. So he's just explaining the psychology behind this. And then propaganda, number 2 there, inserts a carefully manufactured reality in place of actual events. And I'm quoting Edward L. Bernays, who is a real master at this, one of the founders of propaganda and public relations. He says, propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government. Now, many people who consider themselves sophisticated will scoff at the suggestion that a small group of people can plan a deception, a large-scale deception, and carry it off. But we know from history that this has been done and that it works very well. In World War II, there was... next slide, I'm sorry. In World War II, there was a group of people called the London Controlling Section, the LCS. And these were very high-ranking military officers and aristocrats in Britain who were in charge of orchestrating all the deception operations against the German intelligence apparatus. And of course they were reading the German codes at the time, so they knew exactly what the Germans were thinking, and they really were able to pull the wool over their eyes and defeat them soundly. So, the idea that there are these conspiratorial groups that can influence world events or fool millions of people is not only plausible, it's a historical fact. It's been done. Next step, or next slide. So if you want to carry out a censorship program, how would you do it? In other words, what does history tell us about how news can be censored? There really are a number of steps, and I've kind of boiled it down here to a dozen or so. And the important thing is that if you look at the history of the UFO controversy, you can see these steps being carried out, sometimes very clearly and obviously by the U.S. government or the Air Force, sometimes less obviously, but still, connected in some way with government actions. And I'll just go down through the steps here. The first one is censorship at source, or what's more commonly called military censorship. And that's just simply a matter of telling military personnel not to talk about what they've seen. Bob Sellis here has had first-hand experience with that. If you're in the military, you follow orders. It's as simple as that. So if they want to prevent something from getting out, they just order people not to talk. The next step, or next next method on my list here is discrete contacts with publishers and media owners. There are these relationships between the media executives, the top media executives, and the U.S. defense establishment. And it's not unusual for even the president or somebody even lower down to call the president of CBS or some other network and arrange to not have a story published, or to have it published in a different way than the facts would demand. Another one is the recruitment of influential journalists. A lot of journalists are recruited by the intelligence community, and there are many that we know who have gone to work for the intelligence community and later acknowledged it, and many others who were asked to join but refused to do so because of ethical considerations. So this process is always going on to some extent. Back. Getting a little bit ahead of me there. Another step is the monitoring and interception of influential news reports. I'm sure you're familiar with the stories regarding Roswell, where the wire, they were sending the story out over the wire, and the teletype was rattling back and said, "Stop transmission, stop transmission." Throughout World War II, this was typical. All news was monitored. And I don't think it ended. We still have something called the National Security Agency, which monitors just about everything that goes on that they can gather up. Lifetime secrecy agreements is another one. It's astonishing how many people in the federal government are required as part of their job, or to advance within their job, to sign a secrecy agreement, making it essentially impossible for them to talk ever about things that they know. This has become very widespread. Surveillance of organizations and individuals. Again, there are a number of examples that I quote in my book where UFO groups have been monitored, and individuals have been monitored as well. Theft and confiscation of evidence. I'm sure those who've studied the subject know that in the 50s and 60s there were a lot of motion picture films taken of UFOs, and often they were confiscated or borrowed by the Air Force. Footage was removed, and then the footage was returned in a modified form. So this does go on. Acts of sabotage, that kind of speaks for itself. Character assassination. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that if you have a high profile in this field, you will be attacked. It just happens. Threats against individuals and organizations, harassment. And the last two are common in other contexts. Whether they have happened in regard to UFOs, I can't really say, but incarcerating dangerous or uncooperative individuals is not unusual. Look at Guantanamo Bay. Physical assassination. There have been claims that people have been killed to protect UFO secrets, but it's very hard to establish whether that's really true. In my opinion, it's so easy to disguise a murder by making it look like a suicide or whatever. So it's pretty hard to tell. Next slide. I just wanted to quote this little item from Cora Lorenzen's book. The name of the book escapes me, but she reports that on June 12, 1953, shortly after the Robertson Panel met, she was told by Lieutenant Robert Olson, an Air Technical Intelligence Command representative, that, quote, "We're going to try to keep UFO reports out of the newspapers." So it seems that after the Robertson Panel met and decided to try to suppress UFO interest, the word had gone out, to some people at least, in the Air Force intelligence community, that this censorship process was underway. Next slide. This is an example of the many airline pilot sightings that were in the papers in the 50s. It's rather astonishing, but it was reported in 1954 that pilots, I believe they were primarily commercial pilots, were reporting 5 to 10 UFOs per night. And a lot of these stories were getting into the newspaper, so it was a big public relations problem for the U.S. government. And they dealt with it by doing a number of things. Next slide. One solution was something called JNAP 146, Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146. And essentially, this was something that had existed prior to the UFO crisis or situation. Next slide. And they added UFOs, the item in yellow there, to a list of items that pilots were required to report as vital intelligence data. And this had two effects. One, it made the UFO report intelligence information, and therefore pilots were not thereafter able to talk about it with the media. It would have been a violation of security regulations. So that kind of removed a lot of these pilot reports from the newspapers. They began to fade from view simply because pilots stopped talking. They weren't allowed to do it. Next slide. Now there was a backlash against this. There was a group of pilots on the East Coast, 50 pilots initially, and they were later joined by another 400 or so, who protested the fact that the Air Force was censoring media or any public discussion of their UFO sightings. But it didn't have much effect in the long run. I think the airline companies, under pressure by the Air Force, made it clear to their pilots that if they wanted to keep their jobs, they would just not discuss this subject with the media. So pilot reports are fairly rare these days for that reason. Next. Okay, those are just a few examples of censorship, and I just wanted to talk about a few propaganda examples before closing off here. Again, you can study history and understand some of the typical methods for inserting propaganda or for fooling the public with false information. The most easiest is cover stories. If something happens that the government doesn't want somebody to know about, they come up with a cover story. You probably remember the Glomar Explorer, the ship that was supposedly being built by the Howard Hughes to mine manganese nodules. Well, it was really a CIA operation to retrieve a submarine, or at least that's what they told us. So there again, there's a whole list: damage or spin control, bogus investigations, documents, and reports. If you're familiar with the University of Colorado report, it pretty much forced the scientists who were doing the research to come to the conclusion that Condon wanted them to come to. Recruitment of influential people. A lot of influential people have spoken out about UFOs over the years. I won't mention any names, but they do quite often, almost without exception, have consulting contracts with the U.S. government. The use of group leaders to influence lower-ranking members, front organizations, and on down the list. I discuss each of these categories in my book, and I give a lot of examples of each case where this has been directed toward the UFO topic. Next slide. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Robertson Panel and various other connections. As I said, in 1953, a group of CIA people got together and they looked over a bunch of UFO cases that had gotten a lot of media attention particularly, and they decided that what the government needed to do about the UFO situation was a public or mass media program of training and debunking. They said the debunking aim would result in reduction in public interest in flying saucers, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles. Now, the CIA's version of history is that this was never carried out, but I'll show you some evidence here that I think it really was. Next slide. A lot of people don't know much about this guy, H.P. Robertson, who directed the Robertson Panel. But if you look into his background, he was a very highly placed scientist. He was, here's Robertson on the left there, in the company of some of the country's leading physicists, including Oppenheimer and Einstein, of course. And not only was Robertson a very accomplished physicist and a leader in his field, but he was also a high-level scientific intelligence officer for the U.S. intelligence community, and he was the principal liaison during World War II between U.S. and British scientific intelligence. So he's very well connected. Now, if UFOs were really just a public relations problem, and nothing more than that, a case of mistaken identity, why would you bring somebody of this caliber into the process of managing public opinion? You could delegate it to some low-level PR guy and be done with it. I think that this really argues very strongly that the UFO situation was a much more important problem than the U.S. government wanted the public to know. Next. Now this guy on the left there, looking rather sneaky, is Dr. R.V. Jones. He was one of Britain's leading scientific intelligence experts during World War II and thereafter. And he was also an expert in deception planning. In other words, he was one of the guys you would go to if you wanted to fool people about something. He was an expert. He'd done it many times in World War II. The interesting thing about Jones is that he worked very closely with H.P. Robertson during World War II, and they became very close friends. And Jones played an important behind-the-scenes role not only in the Robertson Panel, the CIA Robertson Panel, but also in the University of Colorado Condon Commission, which was said to have been preordained. Michael Swords of the Center for UFO Studies wrote a very good paper about the Robertson Panel and also about Condon. So there's some pretty good research that's been done about this. Okay, next slide. Now, you remember I mentioned this CBS program in 1966, Debunking UFOs, narrated by Walter Cronkite. When you watch that program, if you're familiar with the Robertson Panel and what it recommends, it's rather striking how closely the CBS program follows the suggestions that the CIA laid out as to how the subject of UFOs should be presented to the UFO or to the American public. And when I first started working on my book, I thought, well, you know, you could perhaps if I sort of do a side-by-side comparison, I can argue that this CBS program is a little too close to be just coincidental. I never really, in my wildest imagination, believed that I could tie them together in some really undeniable way. But Michael Swords heard about what I was working on, and he brought this letter to my attention. He was doing research at the Smithsonian Archives, and he came across a letter from Thornton Page, who was a member of the Robertson Panel, to Fred Durant, who was secretary, a lower level guy. And in the letter, which is dated just after the CBS program aired, 8 September 1966, he says, it's pretty hard to read on the screen here, but he says, I helped organize the CBS TV show around the Robertson Panel conclusions. So basically, here you have a member of the Robertson Panel, CIA panel, confessing in print that he was behind the CBS program, that the CBS program was a put-up job, that the CIA really orchestrated this program. It was a piece of propaganda. So this is pretty compelling evidence, I think, that not only was the Robertson Panel planning a domestic propaganda program around UFOs, but it was still carrying it out at least as late as 1966. A skeptic might argue that, well, maybe this was the only incident of its kind, and we just, by a miracle, happened to find evidence of it, and that was the only one. But I think that's pretty unlikely, given that the program was supposed to be covert, and that any ties between the media and the CIA, especially at that time, were not known. It was a very hush-hush procedure. So I think it's more likely that this was just one of many examples of the government and the news media working together to put a negative spin on the UFO situation. And we really should consider how many other cases like it might have occurred that simply have gone undetected because the number of freak accidents it takes to detect these things didn't occur. Remember that, you know, the CIA personnel are not really supposed to put anything down in writing about things like this. It's usually done very informally with no documentation, and certainly if there is documentation, it doesn't come to light because it remains classified for many, many decades. But in this case, through a series of freak accidents, we did actually find an example. Next. Okay, now, if you understand the theory of propaganda and you think about it a little bit, would it really work if you had CBS lying about the UFO situation, but all the other networks and news organizations were telling the truth? And I think if you think about it, you realize it wouldn't pay. It wouldn't be worthwhile. You really have to have all your ducks in a row, all the team players on your side, you know, saying the same thing basically for the program to work. And all we know for sure about the others at the bottom there is that they had close relationships with the intelligence community during this period and probably still do. So it seems pretty, I think it's plausible and supportable by the evidence that I provide that this was much more widespread than just CBS. I want to talk about the National Enquirer, which I just added to this slide. The National Enquirer has a very interesting history. Oh, actually, I'm going to talk about the New York Times first. Next slide. My voice is beginning to go on me. The New York Times, as it has pretty much acknowledged, has often cooperated with the CIA on issues of national security. Arthur Sulzberger, well, I'll go down the list here. This is basically making a case for the New York Times cooperating with the Robertson Panel in the same way that the CBS News evidently did. There's kind of 10 points here. One is that the CIA wanted to suppress UFO news coverage. We know that from the Robertson Panel. Number two, suppressing UFO-related news would really require the cooperation of the major news services, of which the New York Times is one of a number that you would really have to have on your team. Third, New York Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger's policy was reportedly to help the CIA whenever possible. Fourth, New York Times content analysis. This is a study of how the New York Times has covered the UFO subject historically, carried out by some academics at Berry College, show that their coverage became increasingly anti-UFO over time. So it became more overtly biased, even though public opinion was moving in the opposite direction. 5, what I call chronic institutional amnesia, the apparent inability of editors and reporters at the New York Times to recall basic historical facts, even when they've been reported in the New York Times itself. Somehow they just can't seem to, they keep backsliding, you know, they can't quite acknowledge that there is a UFO phenomenon. Number 6, both CBS and the New York Times supported Hynek's famous or infamous bogus swamp gas explanation, while almost all the regional press were scoffing at it and laughing at the very idea. 7 is unwillingness to check UFO-related facts. I think any, fresh out of school journalism major could do a better job covering the UFO topic than the New York Times. It doesn't take a lot of digging. There's a lot of good information, a lot of highly credible sources, but they just don't seem to be very interested. 8, unwillingness to correct UFO-related reporting errors. I won't elaborate on that too much, but I do in my book. 9, willingness to report false CIA claims about UFOs. I don't know if you remember, but some years ago the CIA released a report claiming that most or many of the UFO reports in the 50s and 60s were due to the SR-71 and the U-2 spy plane. And this was picked up by the New York Times and ran as, I think, a front page story without any skeptical analysis or questioning whatsoever. But actually, if you go back and talk, well, another thing that the CIA said was that the Air Force and the CIA were cooperating on this, that the Air Force knew the UFOs were spy planes but didn't say anything. Well, Mark Rodiger at the Center for UFO Studies took the trouble of talking to, I think it was Robert Friend, who was in Blue Book and asked him whether there was any truth to that. And Friend laughed at it. He said, "This is ridiculous. There's no truth to this whatsoever." So even the Air Force was saying that this CIA story is completely bogus. It's complete smoke. But yet the New York Times ran with it. So it's typical of their coverage of the issue. Finally, or let's see, I guess there's two more points. Willingness to oh no, I got that one. 10, documented history of voluntary censorship on behalf of the CIA. Well, there's many examples that I cite in my book where the New York Times has voluntarily censored its own coverage on request of either the CIA, their president, or some other government officials. Okay, I'm going to talk about one more publication, the National Enquirer. Now, you remember that the National Enquirer was the first national publication to pick up on the Malmstrom ICBM story and other similar events of the time. A lot of people don't really understand much about the National Enquirer. You know, you see it on the newsstand, you kind of laugh at the stories. It's pretty famous for having completely destroyed the credibility of UFOs among the general public, as it ran so many stories that were fabricated, although it ran a lot of accurate stories as well, oddly enough. But if you look back at the history of the National Enquirer, it's a fascinating publication. You go back to World War II, there was a newspaper called Il Progresso, and it was edited by Gene Pope Sr., and the U.S. intelligence establishment became interested in Il Progresso because it was supporting editorially Mussolini, and they didn't like that. So they infiltrated the newspaper to find out what was going on. I think what they concluded was that Pope wasn't really supporting Mussolini, he was just trying to improve relationships between Italy and the United States. However, that was the first point at which the intelligence community and the Gene Pope family started interacting. In 1946, Gene Pope Jr., Gene Pope Sr.'s son, graduates from MIT at age 19 in engineering. Well, MIT is a pretty high caliber engineering school, and to get to graduate at 19 says something about how smart Gene Pope was. In 1950, his father died, and there was a family struggle over control of Il Progresso, and Gene Pope lost out. And so he had to go find another job, and he went to work for the CIA's psychological warfare unit, as he himself maintained or said. Shortly thereafter, he left, and he had quite a bit of money in his pocket from a still undetermined source, and he bought a newspaper with it from the Hearst Empire for well, actually it was the purchase price was $75,000. He had an interest-free loan, as he described it, for $20,000 as down payment, and it took quite a bit more funding to get the paper to the point where it was profitable. He spent about $250,000 of funds, which the source of which has not been determined to this day. In today's dollars, that's quite a bit of money. I mean, $250,000 doesn't sound like a lot today, but it's really about $1.6 million in today's dollars. So it's a lot of cash for a 25-year-old kid to be running around with. And it's been suggested that he got it from Frank Costello, who was a mobster and friend of the family. Pope vigorously denied that it came from the mob or Costello. But what we do know is that Costello was also involved with the OSS during World War II. He was kind of drafted to see that organized crime or other criminal elements would not supply the German U-boats operating off the East Coast. So that's where the U.S. intelligence community and the mob started working together. And it was a long and prosperous relationship thereafter. Anyway, the Enquirer, one of the Enquirer's first employees was Bill Bates, a former OSS officer. So again, you see this relationship between the National Enquirer and the intelligence community right off the bat. In the 1950s, the CIA was spending lavishly on a wide variety of what it called media assets, covert publications of one kind or another. 1953, of course, you have the Robertson Panel calling for debunking of UFOs, and then in the 60s and 70s, the National Enquirer establishes a reputation for sensational but sometimes accurate coverage of the UFO topic, and kind of makes UFOs a laughing stock, and sets the pattern for other tabloids to come. In the 1970s, Melvin Laird, who was Nixon's Secretary of Defense, helped Pope get the National Enquirer into the Winn-Dixie grocery store chain. And Pope was asked about this by a Forbes reporter. How do you have these kind of connections with the White House? You're just the publisher of this kind of sleazy tabloid. And Pope remarked, "It's politics. One hand washes the other." So I don't know what to make of that, but I mean, he seems to be suggesting that he's got some kind of cooperative relationship with the White House. He's doing something for the White House, and the White House is helping him. What that is, he was very vague about, but I think it's probably not completely out of the question to think that maybe the National Enquirer was being used as a psychological warfare device. And then in 1988, when Gene Pope dies, Melvin Laird gives the eulogy at his funeral, which again is odd. Now, some people, when I've related this information, they kind of scratch their heads and say, well, that seems really a stretch, to think that the CIA would go to all this trouble of creating this newspaper and all that just to debunk UFOs. But this is not a unique example. There are other examples. There's a story that economist John Kenneth Galbraith, when he was traveling when he was ambassador to India, came across a publication very much like the National Enquirer, and he made some inquiries and found that it was a CIA-sponsored, CIA-funded operation. Apparently it was being used to discredit some left-wing political point of view or something like that. I don't know the details. So this was not, this kind of trick of using a sleazy publication to discredit a body of ideas or to put a negative spin on something was sort of one of the right out of the CIA playbook, if you want to put it that way. It's not an unusual thing. Final slide. Oop, I think we missed one. No. Well, I think you'd have to go. I don't know if can you go back to the very end, or is that too late? Okay, well, I quote John F. Kennedy here. He says that in times of clear and present danger, the courts have ruled that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. And I think this really accurately reflects the attitude of the U.S. government today, and that is that we really can't afford to have a free press in certain situations. And Jim Mars said, he didn't give any details, but he said he was told by a network insider that there were two categories of information that the network had to get clearance before it broadcast. One was terrorism incidents, and the other one was UFOs. I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me. I think the evidence that I provide in my book suggests that there really has been a concerted effort, covert effort, to try to marginalize the UFO topic as much as possible. And I don't think it's because the phenomenon is trivial, as the government maintains. I think it's because it's an extremely important issue and an ongoing issue for the U.S. government. So I'll leave it at that, and if you have any questions, I'll give it a shot.
Thanks very much, Terry. We have an open mic here, so if anybody would like to ask a question, please go to the mic, and I'm sure Terry would be glad to answer. Can we turn up the lights, Dennis? Is that all right?
Oh, yeah, please.
Oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead.
Over here. Yeah, in your book, when you speak of the CBS program, UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy, talking about Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, you raise the specter of him being a CIA dupe or possibly cooperative with them in some way, or maybe just completely unaware. And you said you made some inquiry into that. and were turned away by CBS as he was just too busy. He couldn't answer all those requests. Have you heard anything more, got any more information on that?
No, I haven't. I'd still like to press him on that issue if I had an opportunity. He does occasionally give public talks and so forth, and I'd love to be able to do what you're doing now, to ask him a question about that, but I haven't had the chance.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
Yeah. To what degree can the internet frustrate attempts at censorship, and to what degree can it be co-opted by the government?
Okay. I talk about that. I do devote the very last chapter of my book to a discussion of what I call the new media, the internet being one of those things. And I think the internet is a big problem for the government generally. There's some evidence to conclude that the government, certain people in the government don't like the internet very much and don't like the fact that it's an open source of information. But there certainly are ways of frustrating the use of the internet, flooding it with bogus information, having agents operate covertly as members of chat groups and so forth. There are lots of things that could be done. Whether that's being done, I can't say for sure. I don't have any documentation.
Oh, and another thing, what do you think of these tabloids such as the Sun, the National, the Weekly World News, and the National Enquirer? Do you think they're different than, let's say, the Weekly World News? How different do you think they are than the National Enquirer, especially the Weekly World News, the Sun, and the National Examiner? Because I'm used to the National Enquirer being bogus and stuff, but with the Weekly World News, the Sun, and the National Examiner, they seem to be authentic and stuff, as if to be set up in opposition to the National Enquirer. What do you think of these papers right here, the Weekly World News, the Sun, and the National Examiner?
All I know is that a lot of those, they all work out of the same general area in southern Florida, Lantana, Florida, where the National Enquirer operates. So they seem to be sort of affiliated in some informal sense. But whether they have ties to the CIA, I don't know. I didn't look at those in depth, so I can't really say.
Because the Weekly World News, the Examiner, and the Sun, they seem to be very realistic and very authentic compared to the National Enquirer.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know too much. Yeah, I can't say much more than I've already said, I think.
Okay, thank you very
Rodney.
much. Because I have a bunch of them at home and in storage.
Hang on to them. They might be worth something.
At the risk of belaboring Rodney's well-made point, you say on one hand the National Enquirer is kind of an instrument towards this debunking, and I'm wondering how that's true, in that general perception of the National Enquirer is that it's constantly uncredible information. It's like last night at the grocery store, I noticed they had the cover, I think it was National Enquirer, strange cats found on Mars.
Right.
So where do they have enough credibility to be an instrument of disinformation?
Well, they don't really have any credibility. That's what makes them effective. In other words, what the National Enquirer does, or has done historically, is it mixes some authentic events with bogus events. And so the result is that if you see a story in the National Enquirer about UFOs visiting ICBM sites or something like that, most rational people are going to jump to the conclusion that it's complete nonsense and dismiss the whole thing and not pursue it. In fact, a lot of journalists would say the same thing. They would be influenced by that and say, well, that's tabloid stuff, we're not going to pursue that. So it kind of forecloses any further inquiry by serious minds into the entire subject, and that's the psychological impact that it has. I mean, there's no doubt whether that was the intention, and I kind of argue that it may have been. There's no doubt that it did have that impact. I mean, if you ask people about UFOs, they think of the National Enquirer right away. Those two things just are immutably fused, in the public mind.
What sort of credible stories about UFOs has the National Enquirer actually come up with?
Well, Bob Pratt, who actually is a fairly honest guy, I think, and has done a lot of good stories, has published a lot of them in the National Enquirer, and they were all very well researched and accurate. On the other hand, they've done some that were completely bogus. They did one about Walter Cronkite meeting an alien on a beach and stuff like that. So they make things up sometimes, and sometimes they tell the truth, and you never know which one is which. That's the whole thing.
One last quick point. With the further coagulation of control in the media, where it goes from 50 companies controlling information worldwide to like 7 to 12 companies in, of course, about 10 to 15 years, what sort of impact do you think that's going to have on the future of such information?
I do talk about that in my book also, and I think it's a very bad trend. It makes it a lot easier for the government and the military particularly to control information. A lot of the big news organizations are wholly owned subsidiaries of arms conglomerates like GE and companies like that, and it does not bode well for freedom of the press and democratic society. I think it's a terrible thing. Hi.
Just a note, there was a guy that wrote an original thesis called Flying Saucers Over Los Angeles. He was a reporter from the LA Times. Actually, he wrote it when he was in college. And I interviewed him a couple years ago. He lives out in the Valley. And he told me that when he was at the Times, he was called into a meeting with all the big shots, and the editors told him, he was a reporter, and told all the others there would be no more articles on UFOs. And I believe this would be in the 60s.
That's
so
good.
the reporters, even though they wanted to write something, they would be totally forbidden by the management.
Well,
I don't know if you ever heard that before.
No, I think, I haven't had anyone come out and say it that directly, but I know a lot of reporters are very interested in the topic, but they kind of know, they sort of sense through the politics of the organization that UFOs are not a subject that are going to help your career, so they generally don't pursue the subject. It's self-censorship is really what it amounts to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yep.
After 9/11 with the anthrax letters, a lot of people don't know this, but one of the anthrax letters was sent to an Inquirer photo editor, and he was killed. And I don't know if you think that was a shot across the bow to warn all of the editors of magazines to shut up and not report things, or...
I don't know. I don't know what the anthrax thing was all about. It seems like it doesn't have any obvious relationship to UFOs as far as I know, but
they don't run UFO stories anymore.
Yeah. Well, the Inquirer has certainly changed in recent years. They don't pursue that. And it partially because when Gene Pope died, it changed management. He used to have a lot of say over what went into the paper, and he's not around anymore. So.
And second thing, I don't watch television, but I've heard that History Channel is running UFO specials and documentaries that are pretty good. If cable has opened things up.
Yeah, that's true. Some of the cable channels do run UFO stuff, and some of it is pretty good. The BBC has done some good things. What I'm saying is that the subject is not treated as a news story anymore. In other words, they'll do retrospective pieces, kind of that type of stuff, but it's not a news item that would appear on the front page. If there were a sighting of UFOs over LA tomorrow, very unlikely that CBS would report it, no matter how many people saw it.
How about the Phoenix 5 years ago?
Well, that eventually did get reported, but there was a long delay. It was like, 6 months or something before USA Today reported it? And I think USA Today was the only national paper to do it. I think the other media were completely quiet and haven't really tried to investigate it since.
Are you a regular listener to Coast AM with Art Bell and George Norrie?
I do. I've heard their program, sure.
Last month we had a speaker named Michael Sala, and a couple of weeks later he was on Coast AM with George Norrie. And he was really spilling the beans, you might say. So it's like a two-tier level. You have to say Art Bell and George Norrie are up here, and the rest of the media, it's like a wall between them,
Right. Yeah, but Art Bell is not really a news program. In other words, it's more of an entertainment format. And I think you can get away with talking about UFOs on entertainment formats, but not as a serious subject worth investigating. I think that's where they draw the line.
Well, it's like two worlds. It's a totally different world. But
yeah,
it's a real world too.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not suggesting that they don't do some interesting programs. That's not my point. But there's quite a difference between the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CBS, NBC, and Art Bell. I mean, just in the way the material is perceived by the intelligentsia, by people who are in academia, for example, or.
You could definitely say it's a segregation of the information.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, I want to thank you for coming first, but I just wanted to know if you mentioned the cattle mutilations phenomenon, and since we're kind of close to Colorado, Arizona, the other ranching type agricultural states, I was wondering, since you go back to the 70s, are there any people either in your state or other researchers that that have, or have you yourself followed the development of the story, or people who are researching it, have maybe you've had occasion to talk to either writers that have covered the phenomena, or researchers that have been involved in it? Because from what I can tell about what I've heard, people have gotten a lot of heat, that have researched it and tried to publicize it, or make the story widely known. I can't give specific examples, but every time I've heard of people that research it and that delve too deeply, the FBI or intelligence people really seem to come down hard on researchers.
Yeah,
and the reason why I mention that is because if the phenomena is continuing, what is the reaction to the farmers, or the ranchers 30 years?
Yeah. Well, again, I think you see this strange dichotomy between the regional media and the national media. The regional media do report the story and try to pursue it, but at the national level, they don't give it much time. It's kind of standard.
I was wondering do you feel that you've heard credible reports at any point where the government or quasi-government organizations actually used lethal force against people?
Related to UFOs?
Yeah. Or maybe even information in
I don't
general
know. I cite a few examples in my book, but I can't say for sure whether they're credible or not. I know that people are certainly threatened. They're threatened about not talking. Mm-hmm. I've heard that quite a few times from many different people. An airline pilot told me that, he told me about a sighting he had, and I asked him, well, did you consider going to the media? And he said, well, if I did that, I'd be given a psychiatric evaluation, and that would be the end of my flying career. So people just know, if they're in a responsible position, they know that they can't really push it too hard without, running into problems.
After 50 years of this evolution since World War II, how do you see things evolving now?
Well, I'm not.
What's the
a lot of people think that there's going to be some kind of disclosure or something like that. I'm not convinced of that. I think, if anything, the U.S. government has become more secretive and more closed as time has gone on, and so I'm not optimistic about opening up or spilling the secrets or anything like that. I wish that were not the case, but in recent years, the Bush administration has been one of the most secretive administrations in history. So there's not much reason to be optimistic, I'm sorry to say.
And I think that gets to the wider significance of your talk tonight, particularly the historical background. It would seem that not just in UFOs, but in all matters that are most important to the welfare of the public, the First Amendment no longer exists, because there's always a clear and present danger you can point to, whether it's the former Soviet Union or the terrorists today. And there are enough subjects that relate to clear and present dangers that you effectively censor most where the issues are most important to the public.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the problem with this whole idea of national security is who decides what is a national security issue. There's no definition, no clear, concise definition as to what is a national security risk. If you read the standard definitions, they're so vague and sweeping that they can almost be applied to anything. Even AIDS has been defined as a national security issue. So, you know, it really gives the government enormous power, enormous latitude in covering things up.
Have you done any research about underground alien bases around the Earth and the solar system and stuff? Because it's like a source of UFOs and stuff that could very much add threats to our so-called national security.
No, I don't know anything about it. I'm sorry.
You haven't read Bill Hamilton's Cosmic Top Secret or Val Valerian's Red Matrix books or Commander X's Underground Base books?
Haven't read them.
Or Ultimate Deception by Commander X?
No.
What about
Rodney? That's it, Rodney. Rodney, I'm have to interrupt you there. One question. Last question, sir, for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, one more.
Yes. Do you have an opinion on whether we really went to the moon or not? And
no, I do. I believe we did go to the moon. My physics professor, Robert Pepin, was very intimately involved in the space program, and I do believe that we did send men to the moon.
Well, since there's been a gap of over 30 years, do you think we got to the moon with the help of alien technology, that it was available to us in a window, but that for some reason was shut off and we weren't allowed to use it anymore?
I don't have an opinion on that. I mean, you know, not directly. No, I don't think that was a factor, but.
That's it.
Thank you very much.
Let's all thank Terry.
I do have some copies of my book in the back if anybody's interested, and I do sign them. So
please show your support and go back there and check out the book. Thank you.